It is a Sunday evening in February 2026, and a Boeing 777-300ER is doing exactly what it has done 10,000 times before. Eating runway 10L in São Paulo, 300 tons of aeroplane pointed at Lisbon, 285 people settling into their seats. The nose gear lifts. For half a second, this is a completely normal departure. Then the nose comes back down. The crew rejects the takeoff at around 178 knots, and the aircraft stops just short of the end of the runway with its brakes glowing red in the dark and its tires deflating one by one. Nobody is hurt, and every airline pilot who watches that video knows something you don't. The crew were not supposed to do that, because past V1, you fly. That is the rule, drilled into every jet pilot on Earth. So here's the question this whole story hangs on. Why is stopping the dangerous choice? Three numbers run every takeoff you have ever sat through. V1, VAR, V2. And almost everything you think you know about the first one is out of date. You were probably taught that V1 is decision speed. The regulators have quietly stopped saying that. The FAA and ESA now define V1 as the maximum speed at which a pilot must take the first action to stop the aeroplane within the accelerate stop distance. Read that again. Action, not decision. Which means by the time the pilot monitoring says the word V1, it is already too late to be thinking about it. One instructor and examiner with over 10,000 hours calls the popular understanding subtly, but critically, incorrect. Watch how the number is actually born. On a certification flight, engineers kill an engine at a speed called VEF, at least a full second before V1. The test pilot then sits on his hands for that second, the way a line pilot would while his brain catches up with what his ears just heard. Only then does he go for the brakes. The speed showing on the tape at that instant is what gets printed on your card as V1. An abort begun 1 knot later will not stop that aeroplane in the published distance. Not, might not, will not. Now put a real human being in the seat. Reaction time is 2 to 4 seconds. Start the reject 2 seconds after V1 on a balanced field, and you cross the end of the runway at somewhere between 50 and 70 knots. That is not a stop. That is an accident with a running start. And balanced field is the deal sitting underneath all of this. V1 is chosen so the distance needed to stop and the distance needed to keep going and climb to 35 feet come out exactly the same. Lower V1, and stopping gets easier while flying gets harder. Raise it, and you flip the risk the other way. That is why V1 is never a fixed number. It is recalculated for every single departure. Weight, runway length, wind, temperature, pressure altitude, flap setting, thrust, whether there is standing water or slush on the surface. Wet that runway and V1 comes down to allow for the braking you have lost, and the screen height you must clear at the far end drops from 35 feet to 15. That is also why the captain rides the thrust levers with one hand right up to the call and then deliberately lets go. It is a physical commitment. Hands off. We are going. And the reason all of this exists is written in wreckage. Boeing studies found that roughly 75% of rejected takeoffs happen below 80 knots and hurt almost nobody. About 2% happen above 120 knots. And those 2% are where the overruns live. More than half of the rejected takeoff accidents recorded across 30 years began at a speed above V1. About a third happened on runways that were wet or contaminated. Only slightly more than a quarter actually involved losing engine thrust at all. Nearly a quarter were wheels or tires. Around 80% of the overruns were avoidable. Here is the line that should stop you cold. In roughly 55% of those rejected takeoffs, continuing would simply have ended in an uneventful landing. Dutch research adds the sting. 82% of rejects had nothing to do with an engine at all. A bang, a vibration, a caution light, a noise a crew had never heard before in 20 years of flying. So the industry rewired the pilot. Above 80 knots, you become go-minded, and only 4 things buy you a high-speed abort. Engine failure, engine fire, wind shear, or an aeroplane that will not fly. But there is a crack in that rule, and it is deliberate. Above V1, the takeoff must be continued, unless you have genuine reason to believe the aircraft will not get airborne. In that case, you reject, and you accept the overrun, because the alternative is worse. Investigators keep finding the same quiet tragedy underneath the wreckage. Ambiguity read as catastrophe in aeroplanes that would have flown, which puts Sao Paulo in a very different light. The video shows both engines running clean. No fire, no debris. The likeliest story is a warning that lit up on the flight deck after V1, an overheat or a fire indication, and a passenger later reported the captain mentioning an engine overheat once they had come to a stop. They survived that decision because the runway was long, the surface was dry, and somebody got on the brakes instantly. Wet, contaminated, or a few thousand feet shorter, and we would be talking about this very differently. Brazil's investigators have the recorders. 3 months later, an A220 rejected above 130 knots, plowed through the grass beside the runway, shed a main wheel, and came to rest 6,000 feet down. Everyone walked off that one too, so that is the first number. Here is the second, VER rotate. And VER is not the moment the aeroplane feels ready. VER can never sit below V1. It must be at least 5% above the minimum control speed in the air, and it has to be demonstrated to give a clean, safe liftoff. Pull too hard, and the tail hits the concrete. That is not theoretical. Most airliners are what engineers call geometry limited, and during certification testing, the tail scraping the runway is literally the thing that stops the nose from going any higher. Pull too gently and you burn runway you do not have, and you shave the margin over whatever is sitting beyond the airport fence. Then the third number, the one even veterans get wrong. V2 is not best climb speed. Pilots have believed that for decades, and they are mistaken. V2 is takeoff safety speed, and that is all it is. A speed you must have in your hands by 35 feet with one engine dead. It has to be at least 13% above the stall reference speed, at least 10% above minimum control speed. And it has to deliver a climb gradient of at least 2.4% on a twin, 2.7% on a 3-engine jet, 3% on a 4-engine aircraft. 2.4%, roughly 2 feet upward for every 100 feet forward. It sounds like nothing. It is the entire margin between a bad day and a smoking hole, and every single departure procedure ever published assumes you can hold it on half your engines. That is the promise the aeroplane makes to the airport before it starts rolling. There is one more truth buried in all of this, and it is uncomfortable. These numbers are only as honest as the data fed into them. In July 2024, a 777 dragged its tail down the runway, leaving Milan because a ground handling error put 100 tons of phantom weight into the paperwork, and the crew rotated to speeds that were simply wrong. The card said go. The physics disagreed. And yet the system holds. Across 2025, the industry recorded 51 accidents in 38.7 million flights, a rate of 1.32 per million departures. Runway excursions remain near the top of that list, which is precisely why every crew still briefs 3 numbers before every pushback on the 5th sector of a long day, when nothing has gone wrong in 11 years. So look one more time at those brakes glowing in the São Paulo dark. Behind them sit 3 numbers, written on a card before the aeroplane ever moved. One that says when you may still stop. One that says when you must fly. And one that says how fast you must be to survive losing half your power at 35 feet. V1 is not the moment you decide. V1 is the moment you have already decided, and the runway stops asking. If you